But we couldn't stop the British. After Germantown, they got to Chad's Ford. We drew up our defenses to try to stop them at Chad's Ford. Fierce fighting along the way. Once more, I left my horse to try to fight among my men, and I didn't even feel it until one of my men came to show me the fact that there was blood on my left leg. And we later found that a bullet had passed through my left leg between the knee and the ankle. But it kept me from walking. The pain grew worse. Some friends, particularly a man whom I got to be friends later on with, his name was James Monroe. He dragged me from my position where I had fallen and propped me up against an oak tree so that I could see and direct the battle. And we fought well in Chad's Ford, though we lost. As a matter of fact, the British went on into Philadelphia. George Washington took what ragtags we had left and were calling an army and took refuge in a hillside not far from downtown Philadelphia in a place called Valley Forge. Did that to spend the winter. I spoke with the general and he approved. I went back to France during that first part of the winter of 1777 and 1778. I went back to France to speak with people whom I knew and who knew who I was and knew the extent of my wealth. I spoke to Vergennes, who was the prime minister, and Maurepas, who was the foreign minister. Both of those men were very, very concerned. They did not want to fight with Britain, but they wanted somehow or another to strike back at Britain, to sort of redeem themselves from the defeat a few years before in what the Americans were calling the French and Indian War. And so, while they couldn't formally give money to the rebels, we found ways of spiriting money under the tables, as the Americans called it. I went back, decided that I would go back to Valley Forge. My men were suffering, and it was my duty to serve with them. And I chose to do that. I also chose to buy my men uniforms out of my pocket. They didn't have any money. I had credits back against my lands in France. All told, I have figured out, but I've got to figure this somewhere in these papers. Where are these things? I wrote it down. I've translated into American dollars. $1.88 million of Fayette money I gave to the American Revolution. Nobody, not even Robert Morris, the American, gave that much. But it was my dream, and it was going to make a better world. My men survived in Valley Forge. Many deserted, but those who didn't form the core of what began to look like a real army. And there were several foreigners who had had experience in Europe. For instance, the Baron von Steuben, a man who really was a baron, who had fought in the armies of Frederick the Great of Prussia. And he was one of those who made that ragtag bunch into a group who could fight and win under the circumstances. Couldn't fight like they did in Europe. We had to develop our own way of fighting. And so, in the first part of 1778, after the winter had passed, and the British decided that they'd had enough of Philadelphia and wanted to go back to New York, that army met them at Monmouth in New Jersey. And for the first time, in a wide open battle, Americans, without uniforms, but well organized and well disciplined, defeated British troops. Americans had won some previous battles at Trenton in New Jersey, for instance. But that wasn't a real battle as such. That was a surprise attack. This was a battle. And the Americans won despite all sorts of problems on the battlefield. The British did move into New York. George Washington took up his headquarters in Morristown in New Jersey, where he could keep an eye on those. He called me to be one of the members of his staff. And there I met some others whom I proved greatly to enjoy. I suppose the man who was the most brilliant of the crowd there was young Alexander Hamilton. And I grew to like Mr. Hamilton. I thought he was a little egotistical, but I liked him, and I knew his qualities and his capabilities. Another one that I knew and I was sure would have a great career was named John Laurens, whose father was the president of the Continental Congress. As a matter of fact, I had grown close to his father because after having been wounded there in Chadds Ford, as the British took over Philadelphia and Congress abandoned Philadelphia, I needed some way to get out with the troops who were leaving and the government who was leaving, all the senators and representatives who were leaving. Mr. Laurens, Henry Laurens, offered me a ride in his carriage. So we went from Philadelphia to York and Lancaster, where we relocated the government. There were three of us in that carriage: Henry Laurens, James Monroe, and myself. In situations like that, friendships grow deep. And we learn that we must depend upon one another. And differences, if they don't disappear, melt away. And so it was with us. So it was with us. But I will confess that I agreed with Mon General George Washington when he said that there was something charming in the sound of the whistle of the bullets. It's not enough to be in a room making plans. It's not enough to supervise this and this and this. One must be there. One must be there to earn the title of soldiers. As a matter of fact, with the British in New York, where have I got this down here somewhere? Oh, yes, yes. With the British in New York, General Washington looking at him from Morristown, Lord Howe, the British commander, seemed to be content to be in New York. I'd understood that Lord Howe was a good dancer and he enjoyed the parties that they had each night. And he was really not interested in fighting. Some people even told us that he was friendly to the Americans. But he was the commander of the British. But the war broke out in the South. Southern states seemed to be more loyal to the British than they were loyal in the search for freedom and self-government. And that's what I preach to the Americans. You have to unify. You have to unify. And that's the way you find freedom. And you compromise with people with whom you have nothing in common. The Georgians and the South Carolinians had to learn how to get along with the Pennsylvanians and the Massachusetts men. and there would spring self-government. Most of the writers in those days, and I've got that written down here, I've got several pages on that. Maybe I've overdone it. But there were several people in Europe of great importance who said to us, men cannot govern themselves. It takes the upper class to govern. It's the nobility that should govern. And if the government is not doing well with the nobles, then do not abolish the nobility, just get another crop of nobles. But we thought, and more the Americans thought, people like Tom Paine, who's a writer mostly, and then the soldiers that we had. The thing for us to do, earn our freedom, maybe on the battlefield, but earn our freedom, and then practice self-government. Because the South was so friendly, because there were so many Tories in the South, so many Southerners who really wanted to stay with the king, the British thought they might take the South away from the colonies and bring the South back as British colonies. And so they sent troops. And at first the British troops were greatly successful. They landed at Savannah. American troops tried to stop them and could not. They moved into Charleston. The American general finally, after long argument with people in Charleston, decided that he would try to save the city. And what happened to him was he got surrounded and he had to surrender 7,000 soldiers. We couldn't stand losses like that. It was General Lincoln. He was a good general. But the people of Charleston wouldn't let him surrender their city until he had to. In Camden, there were showdown battles. 2 major battles in Camden, and the first major battle in Camden was a total loss for the Americans. A few miles away, one of the American fighters, a man named Symp, badly defeated by the British. And so George Washington, up there in New York, decided that he had to do something about helping the South. I asked him to send me to the South, but he didn't. He sent General Greene, whom I later began to know and to know very, very well and respect. And then he sent a couple of other people down in the South to help doing the fighting. One was a man named Morgan, Morgan's Raiders, as hard a man as I ever knew. And another, a dashing Virginian, whose name was Henry Lee, who had, with his own money, created his own legion. And when they came south, they found there were some Southern leaders who were not militarily inclined and who were not militarily trained, but who had taken the field. In the state of Georgia, there was a man named Elijah Clark, and in the northern part of South Carolina, there was a man named Pickens, but the leader of these was a man in the northeast corner of South Carolina named Francis Marion. And Francis Marion had developed the strategy to fight against the organized and trained enemy. And they were hit and run targets. No big battle, just hit and run. Sometimes in the middle of the night, often when the enemy is not expecting. General Washington himself began to adopt the same tactics in raids around New York. Well, that's just the first part of our book. I finally did get to the South. General Washington sent me to the South, where I was a commander as General Greene was. And the British Army continued to stay at Charleston, was harassed by Francis Marion around the port of Georgetown, was defeated in the upcountry by Daniel Morgan, went into North Carolina and eventually made their way across Virginia, headed toward the coast. That's what British armies did. They went to the ocean and put the ocean at their back. Most armies don't do that. When you have the ocean at your back, you don't have any place to retreat. You don't have any place to maneuver. But the British had the greatest navy in the world. And all they had to do was to get word to their navy that they had their backs to the water and the navy would come and get them. And the British Navy didn't try to do that. But there were people down that the general sent. I was a commander because I had the rank. But they had people like my friend Alexander Hamilton and my friend Henry Lawrence Jr. His name is John. And his father was in jail over there in England at the time. And we fought and we backed Cornwallis into one of the port areas of Virginia. And we cut off his supplies. And when the British Navy attempted to come to Yorktown, the French Navy happened to get there ahead of time. And the French Navy scared off the British Navy. And seeing his British ship sail away, the British commander, Cornwallis, agreed to surrender. He sent word. By the time he sent the word, General Washington had come down from his position around New York, and he brought some French troops, which the French government had sent. And so, of course, he became the commander. The date of the surrender was October the 19th. October the 19th, 1781. We drew up our troops as planned. The British brought our troops as planned. Cornwallis sent word that he was sick and could not come, and therefore he would not hand over his sword to our commander. But General Washington, he was too canny to be fooled by that. And when the second in command, General O'Hara of the British, attempted to offer his sword as a token of surrender, George Washington refused to accept it. Indeed, George Washington thought that he, as number one of the American and French forces, should receive the sword of number one and not number two of the British. And so Washington refused to accept the sword. General O'Hara then turned, and the French general who had come down from New York with George Washington, a man named Rochambeau, was standing nearby, and O'Hara made a movement as though maybe he would give his sword to the Frenchman, not to surrender to any ragtag American. Rochambeau, knowing the score, refused to accept the sword. And then in Washington's nod, there was General Lincoln, the man who had had to surrender in Charleston. At Washington's nod, Lincoln stepped forth, and O'Hara gave the sword of surrender to the man who, just a year and a half before, had to give his own sword and surrender in Charleston. British struck up a little, had a little band, and struck up a little tune. I think one of the tunes had the words to it that said, "The world turned upside down." I think that was what it was. That was fitting anyway for the British to surrender to people who are Americans who were fighting. even though there were more Frenchmen there at Yorktown than were Americans. He surrendered to General Lincoln. The Americans, for their part, we had a little band over here, and so they played Yankee Doodle, the first American song. Some people thought the war was over. As a matter of fact, it continued elsewhere. I went back to France. And when my ship came in, the police were there to arrest me. To arrest me, although I had all sorts of famous comments made about me and all sorts of recommendations. I was praised by journalists. But I was arrested by the king because he had forbidden me to leave France, and I had slipped away back there in 1777. It had been 4 years, but I had slipped away, and I was guilty of violating the orders of the king. And so he sentenced me to 1 month of house arrest, and then allowed me to spend that 1 month in one of Adrian's family's mansions in downtown Paris, in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, just 1 block away from what we call Place Louis XV. Today they call that they call that now the Place de la Concorde. It was not hard to stay there for a month, and my service was done. But hardly had things settled down before the French Revolution itself came. The French were not rebelling against an enemy like the Americans had done. The French were